Welcome back, everyone. It is Eric from Rare Candy, and today we have the full set reveals for Snow Hazard and Clayburst. This is going to be that new batch of cards coming out in Japan roughly a week from the time of recording, but this is a pretty important couple of sets because this is going to serve as sort of the primary source of what is going to become our Paldea Evolved set in just a few months from now. So we've already seen, I think, roughly half of this set get revealed already, which actually is looking really promising. So I'm really curious to see if the remaining cards that we're going to take a look at today are going to sort of live up to the quality of the other cards that we've seen up until this point. So with that being said, guys, remember to smack that like button for me, feed that always hungry YouTube algorithm, and let's jump in and check out these new cards from Snow Hazard and Clayburst. So up first, we actually have kind of a cool Vespiquen here. If I'm being honest, I don't think this is competitive, but I really just conceptually like this attack. This 120, and you shuffle a Combi into your deck, and then if you can't, the attack fails. So I kind of feel like this card had a chance to be something interesting, like maybe if this was like 90 for each Combi you shuffle in, or something kind of like that, or 80, that could have made this a more interesting, viable, maybe even single prize deck. But yeah, 120 for 1 energy is a good energy to damage ratio, but it's just not quite enough since you're still going to have to 3-shot a lot of the Pokemon that are in the format. But just mechanically, pretty interesting attack though. So up next we have Abomasnow, which actually has kind of a good ability. It says damage can't be healed from any Pokemon, both yours and your opponent's. So there definitely are certain decks out there that, you know, specifically do get hurt by healing effects. Lost Box notoriously is going to be one of them. So in theory, I guess you could play this Abomasnow. The 3 retreat cost doesn't matter that much since you play like a million switching cards anyways, and you can just, you know, send this into the Lost Zone for the matchups you might not need it. I think the issue is there's not really that much healing, you know, in the current format. We are seeing Lugia decks start to include Radiant Serena to help out against Lost Box a little bit. So, you know, this would stop that. But other decks out there like Arceus that play Sharon's Care, that kind of gets around this since it's not really healing in the way that Abomasnow thinks about healing. But I guess maybe if you're just terrified of Goodra, this is the card to play. I just hope they don't like boss it up and knock it out. But yeah, I think its ability is pretty decent in a vacuum, but it's on a stage 1, guys. And I don't think there's enough healing right now to where I think decks will probably want to include a stage 1 to deal with it. So we have a Brambleghast that actually has a pretty annoying attack. It's 3 colorless energy, does 80, and during your opponent's next turn, the defending Pokemon's attacks cost 2 colorless more. So this is actually, I think, almost identical to the attack on Flapple V, but this does more damage and costs more energy. Like I think Flapple's is, I could be mistaken, but I think it's a grass for 20 and does the same thing. But yeah, this is pretty annoying, and I guess you could, in theory, play this with like Spidops EX to try to make it to where your opponent can't retreat and they're forced to just attack with what's in the active spot. Of course, the big issue, guys, is your opponent can just switch out of this effect, you know, and they're not going to really worry about it at that point. Okay, so we have the first of this legendary quartet that's from Scarlet and Violet. I don't know what this group of Pokemon is called just yet, but we have this like Garbodor knockoff from Wish looking thing over here. And it has an attack here. It actually is kind of cool. It does 60 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon for each prize card your opponent has taken. So I think they're sort of pushing this to be paired with the new Fortress EX, which knocks itself out and accelerates grass energy. So I think the idea here is you pop that Fortress, power this thing up, and then have like kind of a decent sniping attack. But I don't think we're ever really building around this card. I think if this card were to see play, this would only ever be like a 1 of, maybe a 2 of in some sort of hypothetical Fortress deck, just because this other attack really isn't good enough to build the deck around. The first attack is really the only reason you would ever want to play this card. Beyond that though, I mean, we can power this thing up with Mirage Gate, and Giratina already does run grass energy, so this could be another sort of late game attacker to maybe take like a big KO on your opponent's bench to close out the game. So maybe this could be a 1 of in Lost Zone decks out there. But overall, you know, I'm not too stoked on this one. It feels like this card is only as good as Fortress is, and card doesn't seem that great just yet, at least. Alrighty guys, so next up we have, I think it's going to be one of the most important cards from this set. That's going to be the first Baxcalibur card. It's a pretty good one too. So this is kind of a spiritual successor to Blastoise cards of the past because it has this ability, as often as you like during your turn, you can attach a basic water energy from your hand to one of your Pokemon. So pretty insane effect. We are losing Frostmoth in the rotation, so this definitely fills that sort of void, and this does definitely have some pros and cons compared to Frostmoth. The big downside, of course, is just the fact that it's a stage 2, which definitely is unfortunate, but the upside to this card is that you can attach the energy to any Pokemon, not just water Pokemon, and not just benched water Pokemon at that. So they definitely do reward you here for going through the extra trouble of getting this set up. And honestly, I don't even think it's going to be hard to power this thing up, or I'm sorry, to set this thing up, because of course we have Hurte. We can grab Candy plus Baxcalibur and be ready to go right there, which is great and sort of mitigates one of the big downsides to trying to set up a card like this otherwise. But an effect like this is still, at the end of the day, only as good as the quality of attackers that we can pair with it. And I will say, prior to this set, there's not that many great options. There is Gyarados EX, which is okay, I guess. There is also a Dragon Kyurem that we'll give a shout out to. That's not too bad. But the big new card that I think we're looking to pair this with is actually going to be the... Okay, yeah, it's actually right below it here. It's going to be the Chien-Pao EX. This is definitely an archetype. They're just sort of serving up to us on a silver platter here. But Chien-Pao has this ability. If it's your active, you can search your deck for 2 basic water energy, reveal them, put them into your hand. So once we get Baxcalibur set up, we can actually just search out the energy we need to accelerate with it, with our Chien-Pao here, and slap it down with Baxcalibur. And this, as you would imagine, is also a really good attacker too. So for 2 water energy, you discard any amount of water energy from your Pokemon, and does 60 for each card you discard in this way. And just water just has so much support between Palkia to be able to cheat basically a plus 180 out of discard at any given point with its V-Star power. These abilities that we can just chain back to back if we can do like multiple switches between Chien-Paos. Yeah, this is definitely going to be a deck 100%. And probably one of, if not the most promising new archetype that we're going to be getting from this new batch of cards. So yeah, these guys definitely seem super, super good. Okay, so we have Slowking EX. This is definitely a new reveal. We did not see this one previously. But of course, is a Terra Pokemon, can't take damage on the bench. But let's see. For a Psychic does 30, your opponent's active is confused. And then 2 Psychic does 130. You can search your deck for any 2 cards, put them into your hand, and shuffle your deck. Okay, so this is kind of like Togekiss VMAX. Same sort of energy, does actually a pretty similar amount of damage. The double Psychic attack cost is admittedly kind of annoying, guys, just because we really don't want to set up Gardevoir to power this thing up, if we're being honest. Like, I mean, I guess we could. I guess if we played Gardevoir, we could play Cheryl, and every time Slowking gets attacked, we can Cheryl the damage off, reattach Psychic energies, and then search your deck for another Cheryl for the next turn or something like that. So that seems kind of cool, but the damage output this card, not the greatest. Being weak to Dark, also not the greatest, since we do have Tyranitar V, the Single Strike, Yveltal, even lost some decks play Drapion plus Mirage Gate. So I'm not even sure if the taking strategy will be that effective given what else is in the format. And then we also just looked at Chien-Pao, which can just knock out something like this. So I'm not sure, guys. This attack is definitely good, but much like in the case with Togekiss VMAX, which didn't see a lot of play, you know, the damage output is just a little bit low, and weakness is definitely, you know, a little bit regrettable too. Maybe something will come of it, but definitely has some challenges to overcome if it does want to see success. Okay, we have an annoying Gothitelle here. Its ability says you can look at the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck. If you put 1 card back and then the other card on the bottom of their deck. And then its attack for a Psychic Colorist is 120, and you discard a random card from your opponent's hand. So you can definitely see they are sort of pushing you to play some sort of soft control strategy where, you know, you're not doing a ton of damage with your Gothitelle, but between this attack and manipulating your opponent's top deck, you know, you might be able to eventually trap your opponent in a situation where they don't really have a whole lot going on in their hand, and you can play maybe things like Path to the Peak to slow them down as well, to further annoy them. That being said, though, it is a Psychic and Colorless, so we would need a way to cheat an additional energy on this thing. Of course, being Psychic type, we could play Gardevoir, but I don't think we really want to play a double stage 2 if we don't have to. So maybe just Raihan is going to be enough. But yeah, the damage output is a little low. I think that's the other sort of concerning thing. Yeah, I think it's just a little weak despite the attack having a good effect and the ability having a good effect as well. Okay, we have Mimikyu. This was a card we did already see get revealed, but definitely an important card we want to point out here. It has the Safeguard ability. We prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon EX and Pokemon V. So Mimikyu is another Pokemon in a long line of Safeguard style attackers. Of course, Miltank is probably the next closest thing that we have right now. But of course, this guy is updated to wall against Pokemon EX, whereas Miltank currently does not. And the attack isn't like super strong either, which does sort of offset how good this ability is. You just put 7 damage counters on your opponent's active Pokemon. But despite how good this ability is, I will say I think a lot of decks do have answers to this already. And that definitely could change over time, but think of Mew VMAX. It, of course, has an attack that can cut through effects like this. Gardevoir EX decks have multiple different attackers that can get through this. Miraidon decks can easily slot in like a single prizer to deal with this thing. Lugia decks already have the different single prize, single strike Pokemon. So even though this ability is really good, I'm actually not sure off the top of my head, like what deck this is actually going into. But card is good. Just short term, I think its future looks a little bit hazy. So Rob Scott is a pretty cool card. This was another early reveal, if I do remember correctly, but it has the Revival Blessing attack. You can choose a Pokemon from your discard pile and put it directly onto your bench. So that means we can actually get, yes, a stage 2 Pokemon and just slap it down on our bench out of nowhere, which is admittedly really cool. But my issue I have with this is that you're already having to, instead of just setting up the stage 2 you want, you're now devoting resources to getting said stage 2 in the discard and setting up this other Pokemon in place of it. So my argument would be, why not just cut Rob Scott from your deck altogether and instead spend your opening few turns just getting the Pokemon you want into play instead? That seems a lot better to me. So maybe there's something I'm missing, guys. Maybe this could get like some of the fossil Pokemon into play. That is one of the only considerations I can really think of for a card like this. But, otherwise, I don't think this card is super great. Okay, we do have Annihilate EX. So Annihilate actually has kind of a cool first attack for a fighting energy. You put up to 12 damage counters on this Pokemon, and then the attack does 20 for each damage counter you placed in this way. So effectively, we can go down to 200 HP now, and then do 240 damage for a single fighting energy. That's actually a really good damage to energy ratio for this attack here. Now, sort of the issue you run into is that you probably can't use this attack back to back, since more than likely you're just going to get knocked out on the next turn. But if you do somehow stay alive, we do have Cheryl, so you could, in theory, Cheryl this thing off, reattach an energy, and just keep doing this 240 attack over and over. But I guess there are also ways you could attempt to stay alive with this thing. Like if you play Rock Chest Plate, after you use this attack, that effectively buffs you to 230 HP, so you might be able to tank a hit there. There's the Lake Acuity, so that's another damage reduction. So I guess maybe with enough damage reduction modifiers, you might be able to, push your remaining HP high enough to where you can take one more hit. I feel like if you can't, though, the card's probably not good enough. It's also weak to Psychic, which is really unfortunate too. So, I mean, you definitely could play Drapion to deal with Mew. Gardevoir definitely seems like a much bigger sort of threat you would have to contend with. And if your stage 2 EX isn't soaking up multiple hits, at that point, I don't think this is probably going to be the best card to play. So next up we have Glimmora, which I think is actually kind of a cool evolution line that we have here. So its ability says when this Pokemon is knocked out, flip a coin. If heads, your opponent doesn't take any prize cards for it. That's definitely a pretty sick effect. And its attack for a fighting energy, your opponent's active is now poisoned, and during Pokemon checkup, put 6 damage counters on that Pokemon instead of 1. But what makes this card, I think, a little bit more interesting is that we have this Glimmet here, only has 40 HP, but it has the Ascension attack where you can just search your deck for Glimmora and immediately evolve it. So kind of like the coughing that we are losing in the rotation. Unfortunately, this attack is a little bit weak. So you obviously would have to play something like Hisui and Sneasel in this deck as well. So that way they take 8 damage counters in between turns, which I guess you would actually need 2 turns of your opponent not moving if you wanted them to get KO'd in 2 turns. So you might have to play this with some sort of hit and run style attacker maybe. So my mind's blanking on the different hit and run attackers that we have, but maybe something like the new Quaquaval EX, or like even his Hisuian Zoroark V, something that can at least poke your opponent, do a little bit more damage while they are still poisoned. So I don't think we have any other great way at increasing poison damage right now. There are a couple of Pokemon that help poison. Like there's a Muck that makes their attack cost, or I'm sorry, makes their retreat cost a little bit more if they're poisoned. But I think it's a cool card. I definitely want to experiment around with it, but not the best one, though, that we've looked at from this set. Okay, so next up we have Murkrow, who's the first of these Wings of Union Pokemon. So coming out in Paldea Evolved, we should be getting 3 of these, if I'm not mistaken. There's going to be a Wattrel, Murkrow, and then we also have a Flamigo, which also is going to be in this same video here. And I did look through this set before we started talking about this one. There unfortunately are no other Wings of Union Pokemon, which definitely does impact how much I like these cards, because it does 20 for each Wings of Union Pokemon in your discard pile. So that means, yes, this is kind of like Mad Party. It's kind of like Night March of the past, but we don't have near enough Wings of Union Pokemon to actually do a substantive amount of damage here. Like, I guess we can use the Pokemon Go Ditto to attack and just keep all of these in the discard pile. So if we have 4 Murkrow, 4 Wattrel, and 4 Flamigo, that's what, 12. So we're capping out at 240 damage, assuming we don't prize any of these Pokemon. But of course, we always do have Hisuian Heavy Ball to help out with that a little bit. But my big issue with these Pokemon is that, first of all, you're just going to get eviscerated by Lost Box just because everything is low HP. So that's already sort of like a non-starter for thinking about this deck's viability. And also just your max damage cap only being 240 is kind of concerning. Like, it's a decent amount of damage, and we can do it for just a single Dark Energy, or just for a single double Colorless, or I'm sorry, double Turbo for the other Wings of Union Pokemon. But yeah, I feel like we would still need a way to push for a big one-shot at some point in the game. I really like this whole thing that they have going here with all of these like bird Pokemon, but I don't think it's strong enough, currently at least, to be anything more than just like a fun deck for like PTCG Live or something. Okay, next up we have Copperajah EX, and oh my god, this thing is a freaking tank. 300 HP, but then also has an ability that says this Pokemon takes 30 less damage from attacks. So you're a stage 1 with effectively 330 HP, which is pretty insane. If we compare this, like a stage 2 EX like Gardevoir only has 310. So yeah, very chunky boy. Definitely like that. Now the big issue with this card though is it does have a double metal energy attack cost, which could be a pain. But it does 260 and also does 30 damage to each of your benched Pokemon. Now, I will say, if we do have multiple Copperajah EX in play, they will actually not take damage from this attack because the ability does not specify your opponent's attacks. So the 30 damage might not even be a big deal if we're being honest. But the big question at that point, though, is how do we actually ever power this thing up since we are losing Metal Saucer in the rotation? And honestly, I almost feel like maybe the Lost engine might be the way to go. And if we go the Lost Box route, we can at least play things like Cramorant to do damage in the early game while we're trying to get our Pokemon set up. And 260 actually is a pretty good number to hit for. That's going to one-shot a lot of these Stage 1 EXs. And you're only at that point like a Choice Bell away from knocking out Pokemon V-Star. So Copperajah actually, the energy cost is a little sus. It's a little bit tricky, but I think if we can get this thing powered up, this is actually not a bad card. So definitely, I think one of the more promising ones that we've looked at so far. Okay, so we have a new Dunsparce, and this was actually a card we already did see get revealed. And actually does have kind of an interesting attack. For 4 colors is 100. Your opponent's active is paralyzed, and you shuffle this Pokemon and all cards attached to it into your deck. So this definitely gives me big vibes of the old Excelgor back from Dark Explorers, but the attack cost is definitely a lot more annoying. I will definitely say that right up front. That Pokemon only had a 2 energy attack cost. This has a massive 4 energy attack cost. Big difference here. Now, that being said, though, I don't hate the card because you have to think we already have a pretty good Dunsparce that we can evolve from. So I think there's a world where maybe even use something like Archeops to power this thing up. So maybe you have like a thin Lugia line that you use just to get your energy accelerator up and running. and then use Archeops to keep accelerating these energies every time you use an attack. And the fact that you're playing multiple Dunsparce already means that you can at least shut off your Lugia's weakness, your Archeops' weakness, etc. And you just keep looping these Dunsparce over and over with this paralysis attack. And if you need a heavier hitter, you always do have Lugia at your disposal as well. So that seems kind of neat. That might be just a little too gimmicky. There are still some other Pokemon we could use to power this thing up. Of course, we have the Baxcalibur we just looked at, but there is also Cherim still in the format. So I think either of those Pokemon could be considerations here. Yeah, it's a cool attack. I'm just a little bit skeptical by how much energy it needs for how little damage it does, but it's not the worst card we've seen today, I don't think. Okay, so we have a new Pelipper. And I think I do remember this card getting revealed like a week ago or something. But whenever we play this Pokemon from hand to evolve one of our Pokemon during our turn, we can search our deck for a supporter card, reveal it, and put it into our hand. Or we can put a supporter from discard into our hand. So it's kind of like the old Holland Transceiver, where you have the option of searching your deck for a supporter or retrieving one back. Like, this is still definitely a good effect, guys, but we did lose Scoop Up Net in the rotation, which means it's going to be hard to keep using effects like this. We're going to have to just keep evolving into a new Pelipper every time we want to use this. Unless our opponent damages us and we use something like a Sharon's Care, but I don't think we're betting on something like that happening. And at that point, if we're playing like a stage 1 sort of support Pokemon like this, is there a world where we're just not playing like the Kirlia engine instead? That's sort of what comes to mind for me, since we can, even though we're not getting a support card specifically, we can make use of Kirlia every single turn of the game, and we have other good evolution Pokemon we can evolve into from there. So this ability I don't think is bad, but I just don't know if this is worth playing over other similar Pokemon that sort of fill this role for a deck. So for the last Pokemon of Snow Hazard, again, we still have Clayburst entirely to get to. We have Squawkabill EX, which definitely is one of the more, promising new Pokemon we're getting in this set. So it has this ability on your first turn of the game. You can discard your hand and draw 6, but you can't use more than one of these abilities in a turn. So this card is kind of like the old Dedenne GX, but there are definitely some pros and cons. Of course, the big one is that this card is essentially just limited to the first turn of the game. But honestly, I don't mind that, just from my own personal preferences. I kind of like that sort of card design a little bit more, just because these sorts of abilities normally disproportionately benefit basic aggressive decks. And the fact that this is just limited to turn 1 sort of does offset that, I think, a little bit. But the other sort of pro to this card over something like Dedenne is that this is not a coming into play ability, which means you can actually get this out with Nest Ball and be able to use it, whereas a card like Lumineon V can't be activated with a card like Nest Ball. And also the attack, I think, actually isn't that bad. It's a little bit underrated. For a colorless energy, does 20, and you attach up to 2 basic energies from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon. So especially on your first turn going second, you can dump your hand and maybe use this attack to set up your primary attacker for the next turn. I mean, this guy does only have 160 HP, so it definitely is a pretty big liability, but I don't think that's going to stop this card. It absolutely is going to see play. I could easily see this going into like a Lugia deck or like a Miraidon deck. Again, I think all basic decks in particular will love an effect like this, but the ability is still, I think, good enough. And I think the card is still splashable enough to where other decks, even outside of like the Miraidons of the world, or, like the Lugias of the world, will still consider this card. Okay, but getting into our trainer cards, up first we have a card I am so excited to have come back. We have Super Odd making its glorious return to the game after, oh geez, when was it last printed? I think it was, I don't even know if this was printed in the Sun and Moon era. I think its last printing was Breakthrough, I want to say. Either way, it's been a long time since we've had Super Odd. We shuffle in any combination of 3 Pokemon and or basic energy cards from discard back into our deck. So since we just lost Ordinary Rod, our best Pokemon recovery options have been kind of clunky, if we're being honest. We've had, of course, Clara and the new Miriam, which are both decent cards and do see play, but I think it's difficult a lot of the time to find a turn to take off of playing a Research or playing a Boss to play something like that. Most of the time, you would rather just play something like a Super Odd and then just play your Research, or a better supporter, if we're just being honest. So this card is definitely going to be great for all sorts of different decks. I am a little bit bummed that this does help Lost Zone decks. That is an archetype that I think actually needs a bit of a nerf over these next couple sets, if we're just being honest. But Other decks like evolution decks still absolutely love to see this and are easily going to play this over something like Clara if they have the option to. So we have Motivational Lemonade. So we can only use this if we have more prize cards remaining than our opponent. We heal 60 from one of our Pokemon. So we can think of it kind of like a Pokemon Center Lady if we're behind on prizes. That being said, like what deck do we actually want to play this in? I think maybe decks like Goodra or even like Arceus decks like Arceus Duraludon, or now that I'm thinking about it, maybe even Gardevoir decks, that definitely could be an option because, you know, if your opponent has pulled ahead, which they usually do in the early game, since you're trying to get set up, after you accelerate a ton of energy to one of your Pokemon, you can use this to heal off that damage and maybe make your Pokemon a little bit more resilient after you've powered them up with all that energy. So that's an option. I struggle to really see the best home for this card, if one at all. Okay, so next up we have Grusha, a new supporter that says draw until you have 5 cards in your hand, but if you have no energy cards attached to any of your Pokemon, you draw up to 7 instead. So this is definitely a pretty cool effect, and even though this does seem, I think, very limiting at a glance, there's, I think, actually a surprising amount of decks where we could look to maybe consider this. So just think of something like the, Chien-Pao, I think that's the name of the snow leopard thing we looked at. So think of a card like that where you're discarding your energy every time you attack. So at the beginning of your next turn, you're probably not going to have energy in play. So you would play a card like this to refill your hand and then search your deck for all of your energy and reattach it to keep attacking. Or even think of something like the Hisuian Arcanine deck. I know that's not been exactly the most competitive deck, but that's a deck that, largely speaking, isn't going to have energy in play. This makes sense for a deck like that. Or maybe even think of the new Dunsparce that we just looked at, where we're shuffling that energy back in deck after we use it. So yes, guys, there are going to be, I think, niche situations where this card is sort of uniquely good. I don't think this is going to slot into most decks, though. This is going to be a card that we see probably very sparingly, maybe even in like 1 to 2 up counts in some of these decks I just outlined. But yeah, this is not going to be the next Research. This is not going to be like the next Marnie, but it's still a decent enough effect to where I think very specific decks will still probably play this. Okay, next up we have Giacomo, or Giacomo, not sure how we, or Giacomo, honestly no idea how we pronounce this character's name, but either way, it's a new supporter that says discard a special energy from each of your opponent's Pokemon. So immediately, obviously Lugia I think comes to mind. If your opponent has sort of overcommitted their energy in play, you can play this to wipe away maybe like 2 or 3 energy from their field, which can be really detrimental since special energy is very difficult to get back most of the time. This definitely feels like more of a control deck style card, but if you are a deck that does struggle a little bit against Lugia, you could eye this down if the Cry of Destruction Yveltal doesn't really fit into your deck's core strategy. So probably a card that we'll see play, but again, only in very specific decks, I think. So our first stadium we're going to look at is Snow Mountain of Disaster. So whenever a player attaches an energy card from their hand to one of their basic non-water Pokemon, put 2 damage counters on that Pokemon. So this is almost identical to Old Cemetery, but of course for water Pokemon, not psychic Pokemon. And we've seen Old Cemetery pop up every now and again. I think very early on, it was a card that Mew players were playing in their lists, but really hasn't popped up a ton, just honestly because this is a stadium that is very passive. You know, you can play this down and then your opponent could theoretically just bump it from play and you get no effect from it, or they lost vacuum it from play. Yeah, I don't actually know if we're playing this, but it's not a bad stadium. It just might be outclassed by other things and might have to wait till counter stadiums drop off a little bit more before it could actually see play. And so for the final card of Snow Hazard, we have Reversal Energy, which is a card, myself included, the community is really stoked to have come back because it's kind of a spiritual successor to the old Scramble Energy, which was an amazing card from, you know, over a decade ago at this point. But it only provides a colorless energy unless you have more prize cards remaining than your opponent, and it's attached to an evolution Pokemon that doesn't have a rule box. In that case, it provides 3 energy of any type instead. So this is absolutely an Eric Smith card right here. This is right up my alley. This directly helps single prize evolution Pokemon, which is incredible. I love it. And kind of makes us have to rethink every card in the format up until this point, because I'm sure we've passed several 3 energy stage 2s or even stage 1s over the past however many sets. And it's like, well, cool attack, but it's kind of unplayable because it's 3 energy and you can't really get it powered up. Now that's no longer a question. This makes us sort of have to reevaluate every card in the format. And I'm really excited to comb through the card pool and see what we might be able to actually pair this with. I know the big one that a lot of people have been talking about is the Wug Trio from Scarlet and Violet, since you're always going to be behind on prizes and this can help you mill, a ton of cards from your opponent's deck. That seems like a fun use. I'm not sure if that's the most competitive use for this card, but definitely one I expect people to try out. I don't honestly have many great examples of what we should play this with. Zorobox is one of the only things that initially just jumped out to my mind. This suddenly gives us a lot more Pokemon to potentially pair with Zoroark and might make that a more viable sort of, toolbox deck once again. But yeah, definitely an amazing card. I'm really excited to see what we're going to be able to play with this throughout this card's lifespan. So next up, getting into the Clayburst cards. Up first, we have the Jumpluff evolution line, which I'm a little bit bummed out about because I do actually really like the general card design philosophy of this evolution line. Like Hoppip does have an attack that on a coin flip prevents damage. Then Skiploom and Jumpluff both have an ability that prevent damage done to it on a coin flip. So that's really good, but Jumpluff only hits for 60 damage, does a 60-30 snipe. And also things like effects of attacks can still just knock you out. So Sableye is going to just eviscerate an evolution line like this. But this evolution line was close to being interesting, but just a little bit below the power level it needed to be. But next up, we have Fortress EX here. So we already mentioned this card when talking about the, was it Wo Chien? I think it was. The Garbodor Wish knockoff looking thing. But this is going to be another Terrestrial Pokemon with the bench protection effect. But we can knock this thing out. Does give up 2 prize cards, but we get to accelerate 5 grass energies from deck and accelerate them to our Pokemon in any way that we like. So I know this seems like a very heavy downside to the card, and admittedly it is. You're giving up 2 prizes for energy acceleration, but we actually have seen a variety of different Electrodes, including even a multi-prize Electrode EX, see play for essentially the same sort of thing. So I don't think that is what would make this card unplayable. I think more so for me, it's, I don't know really what we play this with. That's the issue. Like there, of course, is that new grass Pokemon we looked at the beginning of the video. There's even things like Shaman V-Star, which do more damage for every prize your opponent's taken. There's an Alolan Executor V, but largely speaking, I think the options for this card just aren't that great currently. But if we do find, I think, the right partner for this card, it actually does have a good bit of support as well, because there definitely seems to be a push for effects that reward you for being behind on prizes. We, of course, have Defiance Band that we got in Scarlet and Violet. And of course, a little bit more notably, we have the new Iono supporter card coming out in this set that will, very much so punish your opponent for, going ahead on prizes. So I definitely could see a world where we are knocking ourselves out, going Iono or Roxanne plus Path, and just trying to sweep them from there. That definitely seems like a possibility, and it definitely could happen. But right now, I'm not sure if the pool of attackers to pair with our Fortress EX are strong enough just yet. So next up, we have Chi-Yu EX, another one of these Pokemon in this weird quartet from Scarlet and Violet. But this guy is not the tankiest guy in the world, only 190 HP. And if you are using like Magma Basin and stuff, this guy might be a little bit easy for your opponent to KO. But looking at its attacks here, the first one for a fire, you discard 2 cards from the top of your opponent's deck. So this definitely gives me big like Houndoom Mill vibes. Houndoom EX was like a, I'll say a decent mill deck that popped up during the XY era that did the same thing. So it looks like they're sort of channeling that whole vibe here with this attack. But the other one for 2 fire does 100, and you choose up to 3 of your bench Pokemon, insert your deck for a basic fire energy, and attach 1 to each of those Pokemon, then shuffle your deck. So this seems okay, because there is a world where we can go Magma Basin, attach return, switch into this guy, and then power up the Pokemon on our bench. So that seems good. And fire Pokemon just in general, I think do need a little bit of extra help, because Magma Basin, as good as it is, it's not that great for attackers that have more than a 2 energy attack cost. So if we are playing something like, I don't know, Arcanine EX that does have a 3+ energy attack cost, we can maybe use something like Chi-Yu to power up a bunch of different Growlithe on our bench. And then from there, each of them is only a Magma Basin and attach away from being able to get fully powered up. So I think maybe that is the idea for a card like this. I don't think it's awful, but I don't think we're actually building around this milling effect. I think it's just sort of like a bonus effect that we have here more than anything. If we are going to play it, I think it's more than likely going to be for this second attack. But unfortunately right now, I don't have the best answer for the best partner for this thing. So next up we have a new Luxray with a pretty cool ability. It says once during your turn, if this card is in your hand and you have more prize cards remaining than your opponent, you may play this card on your bench. So I love this sort of energy. I wish more stage 2s had something like this. Now the issue is this ability is on this Luxray in particular, because this attack, it's not that great, guys, if we're being honest. We could play this in some sort of Flaffy based deck if we want to. We could slap this down, Dynamotor onto it, get it powered up. But its attack is kind of average here. Maybe if we're playing some sort of deck where the new Mimikyu is really going to mess us up, you could just play a single copy of Luxray to maybe help deal with those instances to bypass that safeguard effect. But overall, I'm just not sure what deck I really want to play this in. The only other thing I can think of is maybe like Torterra or some other deck that rewards you for having stage 2s or evolution Pokemon in play. I actually think that sounds more appealing than the actual attack and using this thing for its attack. But either way, I really love this sort of card design direction they're taking here with this, and I hope to see more stuff like this on other stage 2s. Hopefully just on better ones. Okay, next up we have Belly Bolt EX. So stage 1, 280 HP. So it's on the slightly tankier side of stage 1 EXs. But 2 colorless energy does 50 to one of your opponent's Pokemon. That's not that great. Then 2 lightning and a colorless does 160, and you can discard 2 lightning from this Pokemon. If you do, your opponent's active is now paralyzed. Okay, so that's not the worst thing in the world, because if we are pairing this with something like Flaffy, we can do a bunch of switching shenanigans every turn to repower this thing up. And even if we're not taking like one-shots with this attack, if your opponent doesn't have a switching effect, a lot of the times you are just going to paralyze them. They stay stuck in the active, and then you just take a knockout on the following turn. So it's not great, but it's not awful either. Like, if we're playing this, are we really playing this over Miraidon, Regieleki, or like Flying Pikachu, or some of the other like solid lightning attackers that we have? That's the thing that gets me. I'm not sold on that just yet, but the attack, it's okay. So next up we have Wigglytuff. Once during your turn, you may attach a Therapy Energy from your hand to one of your Pokemon. Okay, so we did see Therapy Energy get revealed, I think like a day or two before the full set. It's pretty weak energy, just heals your special conditions if I remember correctly. But what makes it cool is that with Wigglytuff, you almost have like a mini energy acceleration sort of engine within your deck. Like if you're playing some sort of deck where you have a 2 energy attack cost, and every now and again, you just need that extra little bump to get your attacks powered up, you actually could consider something like Wigglytuff and the Therapy Energies, instead of having to play something like a Baxcalibur or, I don't know, some other clunky energy acceleration engine. But I don't know if we're playing Wigglytuff over something like Flaffy instead, or like Cherim. So it's another option to have, but I'm not exactly sold that it's going to be the main way players are going to look to sort of cheat additional energy attachments into play. Okay, so next up we have an absolute menace, and that is going to be Spiritomb. Okay, so this thing says as long as this Pokemon is in play, basic Pokemon V have no abilities, both yours and your opponent's. So it just feels like every set, they just keep throwing something at the wall to nerf Mew VMAX, and every time Mew finds a way to just keep going. And at this point, they're just like, screw it, you're just not going to be able to use anything in your deck. Klefki wasn't enough to stop you, Drapion wasn't enough to stop you. Spiritomb's hopefully going to be it. I think that's like the idea here. But even outside of Mew, there definitely are some situations where this could be good. For the sake of example, let's say you are a Miraidon deck and you're going against Lost Box decks, and Galarian Zapdos Feet is a very popular Pokemon. Well, you can use this thing to shut down Galarian Zapdos V's ability, force them to have something like double Mirage Gate if they do want to get Zapdos up and powered to be able to knock you out. So that's sort of a situation you could play that. You also actually could play this in Lost Box decks if they try to use something like an Empoleon V against you. you can use this to shut off the Empoleon V's ability to gain access to your abilities once again. And also just great at shutting down Lumineon V, which is probably the most general purpose basic Pokemon V we have running around. So Spiritomb is definitely a good card. There are certainly going to be decks that are going to be looking towards this. Again, especially if you have a bad Mew V Max matchup, just being able to shut down their Genesects with a Level Ball searchable, Fog Crystal-able, just easily searched out basic Pokemon like this is so huge. Okay, next up, I just got to give my boy Cerulege some love. Don't at me, the best new Pokemon from Scarlet and Violet, like bar none. I do wish this card was a little bit better, but it does have an attack that is 100 plus 100 more if your opponent's active is an EX or Pokemon V. So not a bad attack, guys. We actually can power this up with that new special energy we just looked at, but overall, I don't think this thing is like super high impact. Maybe this thing could be like a Zoroark toolbox target, since we do have that new special energy. But fingers crossed, I'm really hoping we get a better like Cerulege EX in the next couple sets. But hey, just happy to finally have this guy in the TCG. All right, but next up we have another Pokemon EX. We have Tinkaton EX here. So let's take a look at this thing. 300 HP, so a little bit on the weaker side for a stage 2. But its attack for 2 colorless energy does 30 for each card in your hand. And its other attack for a psychic 2 colorless is 140 and isn't affected by any effects on your opponent's active. So I don't think the second attack is going to be too great. We're probably honestly very rarely going to use this thing. I imagine we're building around this first one. And it's okay. It's kind of like the Galarian Berserker Bee that we just got back in Silver Tempest, or maybe it was Lost Origin. I think it actually might have been Lost Origin. But it's a little bit stronger, which makes sense. We are stage 2. It's harder to get this thing into play. But we still have cards like Judge, Roxanne, Iono to contend with. So if we are playing this, we are probably going to have to play something like the Rapid Strike Milotic that can prevent your opponent's supporters from affecting your hands. So we can probably combine this actually with the other Tinkaton. There is another one. There's a single prize one that's coming out that has an ability where you discard a card from your hand and draw 3. So we can use that, cards like Worker, Avery, etc., just to keep expanding our hand size and to eventually do a ton of damage with the Tinkaton EX. And with Milotic being in play, they can't judge us, they can't Iono us, and I think that is the next core strategy. But, you know, I think that is definitely a lot. We have to get a Milotic in play, we have to get multiple stage 2s in play, we have to use double turbo energy, which honestly isn't that great since we are reducing our damage a little bit more. And we have to use supporter cards that aren't as good as other cards like Research. So I think this card has a lot going against it, but it's a fun card. I'll probably still experiment with it on the channel, no doubt, but definitely not the best new card that we've seen come out of these sets today. Okay, so we have a new Whiscash, and this first attack actually does sort of catch my attention. So it says for each fighting energy attached to this Pokemon, discard the top card of your opponent's deck. So the reason this catches my attention is because we did just look at that new special energy that would in theory provide Whiscash 3 fighting energy to fuel this attack. So if we attach that, we're always going to be behind on prizes since we're, I guess, a mill deck here. You're guaranteed a mill 3 every time we attack with this. But I think if we're using this instead of Durant, we probably want to be pairing this with some other way to accelerate fighting energy to it. Maybe something like honestly, you could even use Archeops. Okay, this sounds like actually hilarious. You use Archeops to accelerate like 4 of those energies and mill what, like 12 cards with this thing? That actually seems incredibly hilarious. And you just like keep Silening them back into your deck. That's probably not good since that's like a lot to ask for, but you got to think if you can pull off a mill 12 with this thing, you're feeling pretty good, I would say. But after your one Whiscash with 12 energy goes down, like, what do you do? That's the question. You know, this Whiscash does have a little bit of support. There is the Claydol that can accelerate fighting energy out of discard. There's Gutsy Pickaxe. So there are some things you could pair with this, but I'm a little bit skeptical of this card actually being competitive, though. Probably just a fun deck for PTCG Live. So next up we have Ting-Lu EX, which is sort of like the mascot of this half of the set. And I will say this feels a little bit, at least at a first glance, first impression, this definitely feels a little bit weaker than Chien-Pao its counterpart in Snow Hazard. But let's take a look at this thing. 240 HP is definitely pretty good for a basic like this. But its ability says if this Pokemon is your active, your opponent's Pokemon with damage counters on them have no abilities, excluding Pokemon EX. And then its attack for 3 fighting this 150, and you put 2 damage counters on one of your opponent's benched Pokemon. So definitely the star of the show is this ability. I think this is the reason we would ever want to play this, because this does in theory actually shut down a ton of very powerful abilities. So just think if we're going against like Mew VMAX, being able to use like a Radiant Hawlucha and just turning off 2 of their Genesects unless they play some healing cards, being able to maybe put damage counters on like a Comfey and a Radiant Greninja to shut those off, maybe even on a Cramorant to be able to shut off their attack, or maybe putting some damage counters on your opponent's Baxcalibur to where they can't accelerate energy onto their Chien-Paos anymore. So this ability definitely is good, but I think powering this thing up is super annoying. The fact that it's 3 fighting in particular is really what makes this kind of annoying, because if this was 1 colorless in the attack cost, this actually would be, I think, a really sick inclusion for Lost Box, and maybe it's for the best that you can't play this in Lost Box decks, because between this and Sableye, you'd be able to do some insane stuff to really just bring your opponent's deck down to a screeching halt. So we probably will have to play this with something like Koraidon EX and or Gutsy Pickaxe if we want to get this thing up and running, which definitely aren't our ideal forms of energy acceleration if we're just being honest. And then also too, your opponent can just boss or like escape rope around this thing. Fighting does have a little bit of other support though. There is Rock Chestplate. There is also another new Pokemon tool, I'm pretty sure in this set, that will kind of act like a Cape of Toughness for basics. So maybe we can play that to make this guy a little bit tankier. I'm not sure. This card is definitely a big question mark for me for the moment. Ability, definitely great. I just sort of hate the stat cost if we're being honest. So we'll see what happens with it, but my knee-jerk reaction is that this doesn't seem as strong as the Chien-Pao that we already looked at. Okay, so we have a new form of Gust with Weavile. Though I'm not convinced that this is the best way at switching your opponent's active. But basically it says, once during your turn, when this Pokemon moves from your bench to the active spot, you may switch in one of your opponent's benched basic Pokemon to the active spot. So what this means is during your turn, not in between turns, once it has started to be your turn, you have to actually retreat into this thing to be able to use this ability. And then you can only gust up basic Pokemon with this. So this seems like a lot to ask for. Given that it's a stage 1. If this was a basic Pokemon, I actually would be, I definitely would say this is much more playable at that point. But the fact that this sort of requires additional switching cards to make use of this ability, and what you're allowed to even bring up is kind of limited, means I don't think this Weavile is probably going to see play, despite it having a non-supporter based gusting effect like this. Okay, next up we actually have a Tyranitar that isn't too bad. This is like the first Tyranitar, and I don't know how long that doesn't have like a massive 4 energy attack cost. But the first attack is Route. It does 30 plus 30 more for each of your opponent's benched Pokemon. So it's kind of like Kleavor, kind of like Oinkologne EX. And being a dark Pokemon in particular is pretty good, because if you're playing against a Mew VMAX deck and they have a full bench, which they probably will, you can actually just knock out a Mew VMAX for a single dark energy. Or you can also just dark patch an extra energy to this thing and use this massive 230 damage attack, but it does mill the top 4 cards of your deck in the process. This doesn't seem bad. The fact that this is a dark Pokemon specifically is what makes me intrigued, because you're going to be able to one-shot Gardevoirs, you're going to be able to one-shot Mew VMAXs. 230 means that you're going to be one-shotting basic Pokemon V like Chien-Pao and Miraidon. So, not a bad stage 2 attacker. I don't know the last time I've said something like that, but yeah, this is probably one of the better single prize stage 2 attackers we've seen in a little while. So actually might be a sleeper card here in the set, or maybe that's just hopium on my part. Either way, I'm definitely going to experiment with this card. Okay, next up we have Grafaiai, which was another card we saw get revealed like right before the full leak of the set. But it has this attack: you discard any number of basic energy from your hand and does 40 for each type of basic energy discarded in this way. So that means if you discard a grass, fire, water, lightning, psychic, fighting, dark, and metal energy, you can hit for 320 with this attack. So, I mean, how often are you going to have every different type of basic energy in your hand? That's definitely going to be the challenge with this thing. If we did have Training Court in the format, I would actually like this card a little bit more, but I think you would probably have to build this kind of the way that some people tried building the Smeargle deck, where you play this with the Eldegoss that searches basic energies out of your deck. So you play that, you play this, you probably play Superior Energy Retrieval to get back your energies that you're getting rid of. You probably play Clara, even that doesn't seem bad. Now, of course, you're a 90 HP Pokemon, which is a double-edged sword. It's great because Rescue Carrier and Level Ball searches out the whole evolution line, but you just lose to Lost Zone decks. So I don't know if it's actually going to be playable as a result, unfortunately. Okay, let's go. We have a new Noivern. We have a Noivern EX. My boy Noivern getting the EX treatment over here. Though I will say I'm not crazy about this artwork. Kind of hoping the full art looks a little bit better. But let's see how the actual card is. So, Stage 1 Pokemon, 2 colors energy to 70 during your opponent's next turn. Prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks of basics. Okay. So it's kind of like Flying Pikachu. They're both essentially stage 1s, but this can be powered up for a single double turbo energy. But then its other attack for Psychic Dark, 140 during your opponent's next turn. They can't play any special energy or stadium cards from their hand. Okay, so I definitely have conflicting thoughts about this Noivern. So yes, this is an easier attack to power up than Flying Pikachu's, but Flying Pikachu also can two-shot non-basics. So like, let's say we're going against Lugia as an example, and we're trying to use this Noivern to, prevent things like Stallinger and Tyranitar from attacking. Well, guess what? We can't really play the two-shot game with Lugia, whereas something like a Flying Pikachu definitely could. And then the other attack here is definitely cool as well, but guys, if we're locking special energy, what decks are most reliant on special energy? It's going to be Lugia, at least for the moment. That definitely could change after these new powerful special energies release, but currently Lugia is the sort of de facto special energy based deck, and Archeops can get around this thing. So even though I want to like this card, I don't think the disruption of either of these attacks does enough for the matchups that you want them for. If we're going to use this, I definitely think the first attack is the better, currently at least, just because we can actually use this as a Regidrago V-Star target as well. So that seems a little bit interesting. That might make Regidrago slightly more viable. We'll see about that. The only other upside I can really say about Noivern compared to Flying Pikachu is the fact that it's not weak to lightning, which means cards like Raikou V aren't going to be able to make quick work of you or go like Escape Rope Boss, Seal Stone, and get 4 prize cards. More than likely, if your opponent does have Escape Rope Boss, if you're going against like Lost Zone decks as an example, there's a good chance you are going to be safe from just being one shot. So maybe against Lost Zone decks in particular, this card is actually not too bad. Oh wait, never mind. You can't knock out Sableye, which can place damage counters on you. So yeah, guys, I want to like this card, but I'm just not sure I actually do for the moment, unfortunately. So we have a new Mousehold, and actually this card is a little bit better, I think, than the last time we took a look at this on the channel, because at the time we didn't know we were getting reversal energy, and suddenly this attack is now usable. So if we are playing this in the Mousehold deck for some reason, if we are choosing to play that deck, we can use this as kind of like a one of maybe for this spread attack. So if we throw down reversal energy, we can put damage counters on each of your opponent's Pokemon equal to the amount of Mousehold in play. So if we have 4 of these guys in play, that's 4 damage counters on each of our opponent's Pokemon, which might set up some math for the other Mousehold to come in and finish off some KOs. But of course, the big issue with this deck is that you just get destroyed by Sableye, so it's probably not going to be good. It's that simple. Okay, next up we have Flamigo. This is the other new Wings of Union Pokemon that's in this part of the set. So it actually has a pretty cool ability in this whole archetype's defense, though. Once during your turn, when you play this Pokemon onto your bench, you can search your deck for up to 3 Flamigo, put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So this is really cool because you can bench this guy, get the other 3 out of deck, and research them away to start fueling your attacks, which is, I think, really cool. But again, to sort of recap my issues from before, I think we need one more of these Wings of Union Pokemon if we want this archetype to be more viable. And we also need a way to make sure Sableye can't actually just destroy this whole deck. So next up we have Delivery Drone. You flip 2 coins. If both are heads, you search your deck for any one card and put it into your hand. So this definitely kind of reminds me of old PC, which was kind of the inverse. You flip 2 coins and got a card back from your discard pile. My thoughts on this aren't much different than that. 2 coin flips is just too much to ask for, and it's probably not going to be good. I mean, even despite this being able to potentially set up some crazy turn 1 plays for your deck, it's just too much to ask for, especially since we don't have a way at manipulating the coin flip results for an item like this. So we have Charm of Courage, which I definitely am expecting to be one of the better new trainer cards from these sets. It's a new tool card that says the basic Pokemon this card is attached to gets plus 50 HP. So this is like a direct upgrade from Cape of Toughness, since Cape did the same thing, but it excluded Pokemon GX. So even in Expanded now, if you want to play this on your tag teams and all that, you can. But in regards to standard format, I think we would be looking to play this on cards like the new Chien-Pao that we looked at, like the new Ting-Lu EX, to make these, otherwise pretty promising basic Pokemon a little bit sturdier. So Cape saw a pretty fair amount of play, and given the pretty decent amount of solid basic EXs that we have, I don't see a reason why Charm of Courage also wouldn't see a similar amount, assuming that you don't need something like Choice Band or Defiance Band, Choice Belt or Defiance Band to be able to take a knockout instead. So pretty solid tool card that we have here. Okay, so next up we have Saguaro, I think is how we pronounce this character's name. We heal 50 from 2 of our Pokemon. So it's kind of like the, was it Seabold or Cybold supporter that heals 60 from 2 Rapid Strike Pokemon. So it's okay. It's, I guess I would probably prefer to play this over Pokemon Center Lady, just because it's only 10 less than Center Lady, but you heal from 2 Pokemon. But the more I'm thinking about, I almost would rather play the Picnic Basket card that we got in Scarlet and Violet, which I know heals a little bit less, but healing 30 from all of our Pokemon might even be better than healing 50 from just 2. Especially since it doesn't require it to be your supporter for turn. So this card doesn't seem super solid. But what does seem really good is Iono. This is probably actually the best card in, the entirety of this whole set. So if you've been somehow living under a rock and haven't heard what this card does yet, it has each player shuffle their hand and put it at the bottom of their deck. Then each player draws a card for each of their remaining prize cards. So this card basically takes 2 of the best hand disruption supporters of all time and kind of just mushes them into one. We are taking the aspect of Marnie where your hand goes to the bottom of your deck and combining it with the effect of N that has each player draw equal to their prize cards. So if you know your opponent has exactly what they need in hand, maybe like the final boss to win on their next turn, well, you can play Iono maybe at the end of the game, put them down to a 2-card hand size, and also put that card that they need at the bottom of their deck, whereas a card like Roxanne just shuffles the card back into their deck and they have a chance at redrawing it. So this card is absolutely incredible and was like a 4 of in almost every deck, just because it also doubled just as a decent early game supporter just to help refresh your hand and get set up. I do still think we could see decks make use of Roxanne, especially like if you're a UV Max deck where essentially after your opponent takes 1 KO, Roxanne is going to be active. And in the late game, you would rather Roxanne than use this because you actually get to draw a ton of cards as well. So I think there might be certain select situations where we could see this play alongside Roxanne, actually kind of like how N and Ace Trainer saw play alongside each other in decks like Greninja at the time. So we'll have to see how the supporter landscape is going to shake up exactly after this comes out, but absolutely this card is going to see play in the vast majority of decks out there. This is probably not only one of the best cards in the set, but probably one of the best supporters ever printed. Okay, but we do have one more new stadium. That's going to be Wilderness of Disaster. It says the retreat cost of each basic Pokemon except fighting Pokemon is 1 colorless more. So I know it's not an exact Galarmine reprint, but cards like Spidops EX and Leafeon VMAX are absolutely going to love this, since of course we did lose Galarmine in the rotation. The big downside though is only limited to just basic Pokemon, which is kind of a pain, but nevertheless that is still going to increase the damage output against certain Pokemon out there. And just in terms of disruption, it's still just kind of an annoying card to deal with if your opponent can't find a counter stadium. But that being said, I do think the overall use for this card is, very niche. This is a very passive sort of stadium card. So there definitely will be situations where you'll put this into play and then your opponent's just going to bump it with their own beach court or vacuum it out of play. and it's just not going to do anything. So that's why I am saying this might be a better card for decks like Spidops or Leafeon, because they at least can gain advantage from this card on the turn that it's played, since they can do more damage. But outside of that, I'm not really too stoked for this thing. I think other than the Spidops EXs of the world, control decks would be the only other thing that would really, I think, look to play this for the moment, unless I'm just blanking on something. But overall, seems like a relatively low impact stadium here. And for our final card, we have Therapy Energy, which we already did mention when talking about Wigglytuff. Not too great, but it just removes the status conditions of the Pokemon that it's attached to. So not too relevant most of the time, but if status conditions do catch on, it is nice to at least have an option to sort of combat against those if need be. But with that being said, guys, that is going to be it for all of the cards we're looking at today. We looked at a ton here, and I don't know if you guys can tell, but my voice is starting to get a little bit shot. So I'm very glad we're actually wrapping this video up at this point. But that being said, there's definitely some very high impact cards. I know a lot of players were kind of bummed about Triplet Beat being a little bit mediocre in terms of the competitive cards, but there is no shortage here between cards like Iono, Baxcalibur, Chien-Pao. I think players are going to be a lot more satisfied with this new set. But with that being said, guys, I want to hear from you down below in the comment section. Which of these new cards today are you going to be looking forward to the most? And if you did enjoy today's content, as always, remember to leave a like on the video. But if you do happen to be feeling a little extra generous, you can always become a patron over at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or pick up some merch at rarecandytcg.com. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.